Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Radio Miles, the podcast poised somewhere between the pub and the peer review that aims to intrigue, entertain, and perhaps change your perspective on the writer known variously as Brian O'Nolan, Flann O'Brien, Myles gCopaleen, and various other names. I'm your host, Tobias Harris, and this podcast is brought to you with the support of Birkbeck College, University of London. Today, my guest is Dr. Elliott Mills, who is an Irish Research Council postdoctoral fellow at Trinity College Dublin, where he also completed his PhD. He is currently working on his monograph entitled Flann O'Brien and His Media, Writing in Mid-20th Century Ireland, which will be published by Liverpool University Press. And he is a co-editor of the volume of collected essays, Irish Writers and State Bureaucracy, also forthcoming through Liverpool University Press. As co-editor of a special issue of a journal, Flann O'Brien Studies, dedicated to Flann and the civil service, Elliott has done pioneering work on Brian O'Nolan's career in the Irish state, and we're here to talk about precisely that topic. So welcome, Elliott. I hope you enjoyed my relatively alliterative introduction to the podcast and that I got your bio just about right.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was very accurate. So well done for that.
Thank you. Off to a good start then. We're going to begin with a perennial feature of a podcast, which is for the benefit of listeners who may be totally new to Flann O'Brien, aka Myles gCopaleen, aka Brian O'Nolan, aka George Noel, etc., etc. They would benefit from a thumbnail sketch of the writer at hand. And in this case, I think it would make perfect sense for your, I'm not trying to dictate the terms of your capsule summary here, but I do think it would make sense for your capsule summary to focus on his career as a civil servant, if possible. Thank you.
Oh, I mean, I wanted to talk about his love of dogs, but so thumbnail sketch, I guess I would say Brian O'Nolan, so he's a writer who's also a civil servant, and that overlap, he was a civil servant for most of his writing career. Civil servants, they're not officially allowed to write about matters of current political interest, but O'Nolan did do that quite a lot. My key point in sort of understanding this overlap is that he kind of develops an approach to writing and a style of writing maybe which is always ready to cover its own tracks in various ways.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way to look at it. This connection to the civil service forced him to produce a certain kind of style, which, as you said, could conceal itself, could hide its motives, could hide what it was really about, but also making the track discernible, I guess, at the same time. That's part of the trick, isn't it?
Yeah, and sometimes it's not him hiding that he's the writer, but it's sort of doing a sort of public performance of hiding it, even though everyone kind of knows what's going on. I always think of that, with Faustus Kelly, he's sort of sitting in his play, based on local government politics, and he's sort of sitting in the back of the theatre and sends a kind of actor on to do a jig when they're calling for him to step onto the stage. But we're in the reviews, everyone's talking about the writer of this play as a sort of high-ranking, senior civil servant. And so he's sometimes when he's hiding himself within his writing, he's also almost parodying the process of hiding himself, because, as I said, he doesn't really follow that directive not to write about government or politics to the letter. So yeah, sometimes he's hiding it, sometimes he's doing a performance of hiding it, and sometimes kind of intentionally not hiding it very well.
It's mocking that very process. And even I do agree that the use of pseudonyms to supposedly conceal identity it's almost like one of the cliches which he's playing with, because it's so widespread at the time. It must have felt a little bit ridiculous that there's all these people hanging around in the same pubs, in the same social settings, often in the same workplaces, now all writing stuff about each other, all under pseudonyms, and yet kind of everyone knows you anyway. So
yeah, I think there was a question put to RM Smiley about who Myles gCopaleen was in the Bell, and the guy asking clearly knows as well, and he's like, is it Sean McEntee or or like Shanti O'Kelly, and everyone sort of in that circle kind of knowing that he's also at times doing an impression of like the ministers that he's working for as well. So yeah, it's an interesting nexus of kind of performance.
And we covered this in the very first episode of the podcast I recorded with Joseph Brooker, because we played an excerpt of Sean McEntee reflecting on his work with Brian Nolan, except that he actually refers to him as Myles. So the concealment of identity worked in the reverse direction, in which he was probably known by the name Myles in the civil service after a certain point.
Yeah, I wonder if there was a point in the day at the custom house when he was referred to as Myles, like if it was from sort of 4 p.m. onwards, or I mean, I would have loved to have found him signing some of his civil service work as Myles, but unfortunately, I don't think that happened. Although some of the letters are a little bit more civil servant-esque, and then some of them when he's like working in the planning section and telling the sort of local, like Cork local council that the stuff that you're going to have to fill out is kind of pretty tedious, which is sort of, that's not in the voice of the person in charge of the planning section. They're supposed to be a bit more of a sort of job's worth and saying like, this is exactly what you're meant to do. Whereas like sometimes he's almost kind of commenting on the boring nature of his job whilst being from within the civil service documents as well.
Yeah, so that voice comes out in the work itself, which is not entirely unexpected, but definitely a useful facet to understand. The other section that I tend to ask every contributor to contribute something on is this question of how you found Flann O'Brien, because I remember, I think the first time we met was an event that we were doing at Birkbeck on At Swim Two Birds back in 2016. Seems like a long time ago now. That probably wasn't the first time you came across Flann. So how did you encounter Flann O'Brien?
Yes, so I think I first read At Swim Two Birds when I was an undergrad. I was already a bit of a tiresome Joyce enthusiast. I remember At Swim was on a list of 100 greatest novels in The Guardian, I think. I was interested in metafiction, so I picked it up straight away and then read all the other stuff pretty immediately. It served as a really interesting counterpoint to the modernisms modules that I was doing at the time, in England, which didn't feature Flann O'Brien. And then I ended up doing my undergrad dissertation on Flann. And then by the time I got to my master's, I was then obviously obsessed with Derrida. So I combined that interest with The Third Policeman in an essay. But yeah, so it was kind of fun that it was my own little personal interest that I was developing. And then obviously when I started to do work on Flann in Ireland, it was kind of a completely different situation. And in fact, the person I was sitting opposite in the Trinity Long Room hub, his dad was related to Brian Nolan. So it was kind of became a lot more connected to that sort of network of people who are working on Flann O'Brien and maybe even have like stories about him.
Yeah, this is a trajectory that I can empathize with, coming from this space of, well, firstly, you're just interested in Flann O'Brien because the writing is adjacent to the modernism that you get taught at an undergraduate level, but seems very different. Something strikes you in particular because it's just so funny, so that kind of piques your interest. And then you kind of go through the stage of understanding the theoretical importance of what he's doing and the relevance to a lot of different types of critical theory or psychoanalytic theory, take your pick really, but Derrida is a good one. And then almost like, I don't know if it's the final stage or if there's a level of evolution after this, but then as you get deeper into it, you start to understand the Irish context and the people that knew him. And something very different emerges, right? There are these different layers to the onion of exploration.
And then when you get to that stage, you have to pick a course through all the various contexts that you approach his works through over those different stages.
Yeah, absolutely. And make it work together, which I think your work absolutely does. The next bit we wanted to cover was one of your favorite extracts. I wonder which you've picked up. We have not prepared this at all in advance. I'm completely new to it. I quite like this, actually, this sense of danger at this point of the podcast in this context. So I just don't know what you're going to read. Over to you, Elliott.
Okay, well, yeah, I thought I'd read a bit from Krishkeen Lawn, so his column in the Irish Times, which he writes on the name of Myles na gCopaleen. This is a column from the 21st of August, 1946. And Myles writes, I've been studying the characteristics and habits of civil servants for years because they are in reality very interesting persons. Persons, mind, not people. He starts to describe the sort of work of the civil servant. There are large mounds of documents on his desk. These represent his work. He frowns slightly. He views his work with grave concern. Certain portions of it he views with anxiety. In his view, there is pressure of work. The work is, however, under consideration. Certain separate matters are under review. Others are under active consideration. A decision will be taken only on consideration of the facts in all their aspects. These facts will, in the meantime, be under continuous and active review, and a decision will be announced at an early date. At the moment, he finds himself unable to concur in any suggestion that any of these matters at the moment fall to be dealt with by him. At 2:30, he is again engaged on having matters under active consideration in all their aspects. He requests the early submission of further details. I mean, there are lots of bits like this in the column where you get a sense of, he does write about the civil service quite a lot under the persona of Myles. And here there's the identity being consumed by the sort of medium of bureaucratic communication and these sort of linguistic tendencies which leave no stone unturned, but they take the unturning too far and they sort of start with the stone furthest away. And I thought I also might just read a bit of genuine bureaucratic literature to give you a sense of the kind of stuff which might be influencing this particular kind of penchant for recursive, quite lengthy sentences. So this is from the Local Government Act 1941, which is about the minister being corporation soul of the department. And this very long sentence reads, where any doubt, dispute, or question arises, or in the opinion of the minister is likely to arise as to whether any particular position under a local authority is or is not for the purposes of this act, or of any of the acts which may be collectively cited with this act, an office, or as to whether a particular person is or is not for any of the said purposes an officer, such doubt, dispute, or question shall be decided by the minister, and such decision shall be final. On the level of the prose and like the kind of meaning of it is that the civil servant does not take decisions, and kind of bits of work that the civil servant will be, working on each day, in the end, that they will cease to be under the kind of ownership of that civil servant. Things are decided by the minister. But it's also like the kind of prose that Myles is working with also enacts this idea, like on the level of the sentence, where these phrases like under consideration and then even under active consideration, like the consideration becomes slightly more passive when it's repeated and when active is sort of added to it. It seems like this was a sort of rich vein of influence in terms of comic prose style, but also there's something going on here to do with O'Nolan's conception of the writer, also in his literary works, in a way which sort of problematizes independence, like active agency of the writer, which he doesn't necessarily get from being a civil servant, but which is also clearly relevant to his civil service work.
Yes, absolutely. And just to weave in a bit of exposition into my response, he joins the civil service in the mid 1930s, and he remains there for quite a few decades until the mid 1950s, when he's retired from the civil service and the circumstances we might want to discuss. And the work that's happening on his first novel, Swim Two Birds, although it's a product of his undergraduate and graduate years at university in many ways, as a finished product, it's always something that's sort of edited and produced and finished and finalized under the auspices of the civil service. And there's the anecdotes that suggest that John Garvin, his civil service manager, was actively involved in some ways in reviewing the text, suggesting improvements, and even suggesting potentially the epigraph for it.
Yeah.
So it's woven into his development writer. What I like about the two examples of the prose that you've shared from the column from 1946 and the Local Government Act, for some reason, I just see this act as among somehow in my brain the more notorious of Irish government acts of the 1940s. It seems to have so many strange like resonances, like it had very positive purposes, I suppose, but it seems to be notorious in some other ways. There's a displacement of agency from in the case of the Myles excerpt, the act of doing something to a form of doing as contemplation through the weaving of language. So as you were saying, the prose is performative in the sense, if we keep saying that something is under consideration, under active consideration, the facts involved will be under constant review, more details will be requested. There is a form of attenuated power happening here through the construction of this fabric of passive voiced phrases and cliches, which all put together suggest a kind of vague power around the idea that this contemplation is happening in the first place. Like the veil itself that language throws over the matter at hand, it's like describing the work around the work, or the work around the work around the work. There's a power to it that almost seems quite prophetic and meaningful. But then the second extract that you read from the Local Government Act made it clearer that the context of this is that this active form of contemplation, or very prosy form of contemplation, where it's prolific but yet low on kind of decision-making density, that is kind of the lack of power that servants felt they had. I guess what I'm rounding on is what's the form of power that's at work here in this convoluted approach?
Well, yeah, I think you use the word performative there, and I think that's really key, isn't it? And I guess neither of us are talking about performative in the common way that's used now, mean a performance of pretending that something's the case. It's not quite that. It's kind of more, I know Joe Brooker has talked about the importance of J.L. Austin's idea of the performative sentence. It's not quite describing, it's actually performing the action. It happens in Faustus Kelly as well, where there are small examples of the things that Kelly doesn't want to read. If he says, mark them as read, then officially they kind of have been read. And that also sort of decides the action that he wants to sort of be taken in relation to whatever it was, which in other words would just be to kind of ignore it. But it's a way of framing that decision through sort of official terminology that actually does carry out an action in itself. And then also, but at the same time, as you say, there is also a diminishing agency in the language as well. And I increasingly think it is important when you go to a novel like The Third Policeman, obviously this protagonist is a murderer, but it kind of seems as though he's being punished for a kind of bureaucratic way of looking at the world and sort of writing and expressing himself. So just as we had in those examples a kind of idea that the civil servant increasingly frames things in a sort of passive way, like at the start of, I was thinking about how in the start of The Third Policeman, we have like the first person in how everyone knows how I killed old Philip Mathers. But then like everything after that is a sort of carefully defined clause which kind of provides subsidiary information. And by the end of the first page, that I that was there in I killed old Philip Mathers is lost, and it's replaced with a description of the weapon and then who the person was who had the original plan, and he was personally responsible in the first place. He brought this. It's almost like in the same way that the civil servant's describing how this work was brought to my desk. It's been considered. It's not my responsibility at the moment to do anything, but it's been considered and I can kind of explain what it is. But I suppose that in a way, depending on how it's wielded, that can be a power in itself, a power of evasion.
A power of maintaining your position of power by suggesting there's elements of this process that are obscure to someone else that you have ownership of. I think it also reminds me of the opening to John Duffy's Brother, the short story, where you've got this reference to a Joycean short story initially, but then the actual opening through this layers of detachment moves away from that sense of certainty about who the person might be that is relaying the story, how that person might be known to them, and then positions what happens in this kind of strange space. So it seems like a similar movement of you work yourself into this almost fantasy realm by progressively detaching the narrative voice from any identifiable person. I find that's one of the many fascinating parts about bureaucratic language, is that in many cases it is about determining what a person is and what rights and responsibilities that person has. And it's whether that person is an entity like an organization or a company, or whether that person is indeed a person, a human person. Through bureaucratic language, this constant tussle of what is a person, what isn't a person, is where power does, I think, keep coming back to this question of power. Power does exert itself, because if that slippage it becomes too extreme, then through bureaucratic language, of course, and this happens a lot, people, entities, nations even lose their personhood altogether. It's very easy to obscure it. I don't know if there's also maybe some kind of commentary on that too.
Yeah, definitely. I think so. And you mentioning John Duffy's brother, this is their kind of private law firm, but he walks into the office and expresses something of his inner life. And having thought a lot about Brian Erlen and bureaucracy, it's almost as though there's a coded suggestion that it would be as odd to walk into the custom house and express yourself, your inner life, or your actual beliefs. It would be as odd to do that as it would be for John Duffy's brother to walk into the office and say that he is a train. It would kind of be treated as like, I guess that's like sort of a joke, or you've kind of gone a bit mad. We'll play along with it for 20 minutes, but then can you just go back to being your kind of normal? In that case, I suppose, yeah, there also is a safety for him in being able to re-engage with that framework that is in that short story when he sort of, becomes too afraid of what the stakes are of actually revealing himself.
Yeah, I do agree with that analysis. It's almost like the transformation into the train stands for some kind of explosive release of a persona that isn't compatible with the working persona. That's kind of what the meaning of the text is, I guess. It's a kind of queer text, isn't it? It's not necessarily a thing about sexuality per se, but about a kind of alterity, within us that is repressed in its normative surrounding. But we're going to move on because there's more I wanted to ask you about. I'm interested in digging further into this connection between bureaucratic work and literary work at the level of poetics. And so in your introduction to the special issue on Oh Noble Civil Service you edited, you used Kafka as an example, referring to another Kafka critic, Ben Kafka's theories on paperwork and bureaucracy in his book, The Demon of Writing. Kafka presents the idea that a forever unfinished status of paperwork makes it a symbol of the interminable sense of lacking which desire both requires and sustains. Kafka's reading of bureaucracy as a function which at once produces and thwarts desire can be likened to Nolan's poetics of dissatisfaction, which so often, as in the writer figures of The Third Policeman at Swimty Birds and in a different way Christine Lawn, sets out to explore the limitations just as much as the possibilities of authorship. So it's a really fantastic point about the link between poetics of dissatisfaction and bureaucracy as a function which at once produces and thwarts desire. This has kind of taken us in more of a psychoanalytical direction, I suppose, as a reading. But I wondered if you could give some more examples of what we might describe the bureaucratic poetics of O'Nolan in the way that that quote suggests.
Yeah, so I guess you touched on The Third Policeman already, but obviously, this protagonist, in that case, like murder doesn't get him what he wants, but also he has a kind of highly conditional and self-thwarting, but at the same time, repetitious and recursive way of framing things and expressing himself. So it's kind of the combination between the action and expression not getting him to where he wants to get to, but also it being highly predictable, the direction he's heading. And that's why his punishment is to have that played back towards him. So this obsessive writer narrator's own recursiveness is directed back towards him. It's the horrifying predictability that is almost the most terrifying thing, where, you know, when he's pushing Mikushkin's chests, which seem to be getting smaller and smaller beyond sense. So there's that angle, but there's also a kind of, I suppose on one level it might be a bit less dark, but it also relates to this sense of dissatisfaction, short-circuited kind of communication, which I think comes through a lot in his writing as Myles in the Irish Times. And it also plays out in that column in a way which often reflects aspects of his job. So I think we can see this in his columns about the ventriloquist service. So Myles comes up with this plan of selling a kind of ventriloquist escort service. So if you think you're stupid, you hire a ventriloquist to accompany you to public places. They do all the talking, so you sound smart. But then as these columns run on, the ventriloquists, they sort of unionize, they demand for higher pay. And then there's this quite interesting column where Myles describes how the ventriloquists are entering the room at the same time as Myles hears himself saying, well, gentlemen, I'm not surprised to see you. I recognize that the wages are too low and I'm going to increase them by 50%. That's the least I can do. And so, as I say, there's a sort of self-thwarting, kind of short-circuited process of communication here, which I think is also to do with his civil service work. If we look at the fact that these columns, they definitely cluster in that sort of 1941 to 42 period. And from August 1941 to April 1943, that's when O'Nolan was probably most likely writing speeches for Sean McEntee. So he's also kind of engaging with this writing whereby he writes something and it's not his own words. He's kind of writing as the voice of someone else, but also in a way where in his literary imagination, he imagines that process to turn writing into something that can trap the writer. Is it interesting that you can see the plot structure of At Swim Two Birds in a microcosm as well in that article? But yeah, there are sort of darker implications and then everyday writing practice implications of this idea of writing as connected to paperwork, which in turn is connected to a kind of lack of fulfillment.
Yeah, I really like that comparison. I think it's a really good explanation of an analysis of the appearance of the escort service. And it's interesting how it emerges in some ways genetically in the columns from the sequence on WAMA, you know, the Writers, Artists and Musicians Association, which is a parodic version of Sean Whalen's organization of the same name. But actually the origins of the escort service belong to, I guess, the psychology of knowing that everything you write is being ventriloquized in some way, you know, it's been taken from you. And as you said, it's not becoming your own. And that sense of dissociation between what is being said and what is being thought or what is being meant that that environment must have created. So I do think it's a really interesting method of reading O'Nolan overall, actually, of understanding that the performances of his texts, the absurdities of the jokes, they do represent a fealty to some kind of representation of experience, but it's nearly always displaced. It's just never simple enough that it's a direct connection. There's a set of substitutions that happen, that there's the atmosphere that's in his head as a civil servant, as a creative writer, knowing what's happening to his words, that in the column is transmuted into the atmosphere of Dublin overall, where no one can quite believe anymore whether anyone's words are their own words. I love that.
Oh, well, yeah, you put it really well there. And I'm glad that you were the one to mention how much he takes the piss out of Sean O'Whalan, because There's a Flann scholar. When I was doing my PhD, he's at Trinity. It's like, why don't you leave Flann alone? I'm like, it's not me. It's this Flann is doing it. I'm just writing about it. But so yeah, I'm trying to distance myself from that.
Yeah, that's for another episode, I think, before we caught more controversy.
That's a 10-part series.
It's a saga, it's not a series. We have to capture their closeness as well as the distance between them. You know, they did collaborate in certain ways, but yet there's just something about Elon, I think, just not being. I think the critique is quite an insidious one. He's just not savvy enough, is he? He's just not quite smart enough to keep up with Myles. I think that's the latent critique of like he's being too direct about things, which is really interesting. And I think at some point we've got to turn back to those pieces that Nolan wrote for of Wayland's magazine, The Bell, right? You know, like dance halls, you know, the trade in Dublin and so on, drinking time in Dublin. We should look at those, but we don't have time to do that now. We're going to carry on. And I wanted to ask you about whether you thought about the politics of O'Nolan himself. So previous guests in the podcast have described the Newlon family overall because, you know, the political involvements run wide and deeply, you know, in that family as eccentric state builders, people who were interested in building up the Irish state, but felt the way to do it was to do so from the margins, to do good work, but from the margins, you know, to attack it, which doesn't seem like a crazy plan. But I think you often see that anarchistic tendency to challenge the state. The politics, if you read carefully and go past a lot of the layers of humour, seem to lean towards a reformist but pragmatic status, leaning slightly towards the economic left, I'd say. And of course, Paul Fagan has recently retrieved an article entitled Cultural Affairs, where he evaluates the cultural worth of the Irish economy for a magazine called The Statist. It's a funny name. I imagine statism was pretty in vogue in the 1940s and 50s, you know, whatever side of the Cold War you're on. So that's giving us a sense of quite a kind of moderate politics that is traceable, but I'm wary of labeling him with any political label. What's your thoughts on the state as a philosophical concept? And is he a statist? Is he a liberal? Is he an anarchist? What do you think?
Well, I was really pleased when I saw that Fagan had discovered this new bit of writing, because it was sort of like the view that I felt that I might have been implicitly kind of pinning on O'Nolan sometimes without him explicitly saying these things, just because there is that kind of pragmatism. Like, for example, when he's sort of falling in line a bit with McEntee in opposing what he sees as copying post-war welfare reform, but not on the grounds that, but it's only ever on the grounds that it's either it's a big idea which has got quite far before the details have been worked out. It's not like opposing the ideal in itself. It's sort of opposing ideas like this when he kind of spots that it might be rhetoric which hasn't worked out how that kind of rhetoric turns into a practical plan. I've been doing a bit of work, as you have, with O'Nolan and the media, and I think we can see this argument that Fagan finds from this article in some of his writing about the radio, for instance. In that article, Cultural Affairs, is this idea that cultural isolationism is not sustainable when it's being paired with the packaging of Irish culture for export, and then, you know, not opening Irish culture up to foreign influence or strengthening it with subsidies. And I think he notes this in some of the rhetoric about the expansion of state radio in Ireland. So in one article, 1947, he's questioning Ireland's scheme to send her voice to the ends of the earth. He's saying, like, is it morally admissible? Is it, and he kind of frames it in militaristic terms, like saying it's an aggression. Is it a lawful aggression, this holy war? And I think in that, and in quite a lot of his writing as Myles, you can see this sort of media attuned ear that is actually a little bit ahead almost of the sort of historiography which would later come, which would say that the development of the Irish Free State at the time is simply a kind of inward turn and a sort of deforming provincialism. Eve Patton summarizes that view with that phrase. Whereas Myles and kind of O'Nolan is noting that, like, there is that provincialism there, but there's almost like a sort of corollary, which is that you sort of turn inward and then you have a wish to wield the kind of newly minted cultural capital from turning inward by sending it outwards, but without then doing the other side, opening up to global influence in terms of culture and in terms of the economy. It seems like whether or not he thought this was a great idea, in the abstract, it seems as though he's feeling his way forward towards what a kind of modernized, necessarily transnational and transactional economy and mediated cultural landscape Ireland was going to necessarily have to become. It seems like he's tapped into the practicalities of what needs to necessarily happen or what can happen, as opposed to the sort of earlier ideals of, I suppose, the sort of self-sustaining protectionism and isolationism.
I think, to try to summarize, which is a fantastic point, by the way, or a set of points, Myles is, we can look backwards on these opinions and his stance on certain things in the wake of what finally happened and miss the point here by putting him on one side or the other. It's not really about taking a side. It's about understanding the complex nature of things, about how big projects can tend to rebound upon themselves and produce the opposite of the intended results. His critique of the Irish plans for an Irish welfare state centre on the potential kinks in that plan. For example, if you could accidentally create a new tax authority centred on the church in Ireland, if you allow the church to run these welfare schemes, as one of his critiques. It's just a detail that hasn't really been thought out. And I think he's able to understand that process of folding over, that process of complexity, how systems emerge through patterns like S-curves, plans aren't realized, and there's contradictions. And you have to be able to be savvy to those contradictions and paradoxes to make progress. So I love that reading. My very last question for you, Elliott, before we finish up, is just if you could give us a feel for what it's like to work in the National Archives of Ireland that hold the archive of Nolan and the civil service. This is not an archival source that most people have access to. Most people listening to the podcast would have maybe looked at the collected letters, for example, but you've had experience of working in civil service archives. Could you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I suppose that one of the main things I got out of that is that the role of the private secretary is this node of transmission, that the signing of a name on a letter doesn't give you direct access to the person who signs the name, in a sense. And it later became a stamping of his name. It'll often be on a very brief letter from the minister to explain that he has read the letter that has been sent to him. There was a lot of reading of that sort of stuff. In getting a sense of the monotony of those tasks, it almost becomes even more strikingly clear when you do get access to O'Nolan in a different kind of mode. And like, for example, when I then looked at the Cavan fired the report into the tribunal, which he had to write up, like there are little moments there where you can see that he hasn't just sort of done the equivalent of signing his name. There's a little bit of O'Nolan himself coming through. Like there's this phrase that he uses, which I don't think he got from someone else, saying that the person in charge of the orphanage just says she lost her head at the end of this quite measured description of the things that they tried to do and the things that they could have done better, and the way in which better training and more initiative will help future situations. And then there's this phrase, she lost her head, which, if you go back to different works, he uses this in his fiction character, saying, was she off her head? And Handsome Carver's husband, going mad, goes off his head completely. So it gave me a sense of the different modes of writing, some of which are disconnected to the writer and actually almost enact that process, the idea that the person who signed a piece of writing is not the person who takes responsibility for the writing. And then the very rare occasions I'd get excited about these moments where it's like, hang on, there's something slightly different going on. He's maybe not doing exactly what he's meant to be doing. It's a sort of long prose. And of course, there's also a lot of reading of a lot of stuff which have nothing to do with O'Nolan.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like a chase for traces of identity, growing stronger or fainter or changing shape. It sounds really fascinating on a number of theoretical and personal levels. Well, Elliott, thanks so much for a very rich podcast. It's been really fascinating to hear more about how this work in the civil service informed poetics and the poetics of Enolan in quite surprising ways. So yeah, it's been a real privilege to have you on the podcast. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. It's been really fun.